Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Real History. I am your host, Jared Frederick, and we are once again joined by my friend and public historian extraordinaire, Emily Doherty. Thank you for joining us one more time.
Thank you for having me back again.
All right. So perhaps you can offer us a brief recap of what we discussed for episode 1.
So we talked a lot about the actions of what has come to be known the Boston Massacre and the trial that followed and the splintering of relationships that happened in the early years just prior to the American Revolution breaking out into fighting.
And that sets us on the road to Philadelphia, where much of this episode will take us. So let's go ahead and take a look at episode 2 of John Adams, entitled Independence.
I would read into the record for the benefit of those delegates.
So it's a very iconic opening shot of Independence Hall, and the production designers did a fantastic job of recreating the building and the space, both outside and within. Just one major problem here, of course, at the beginning of this episode.
It didn't happen in Independence Hall. Minor issue.
Yeah. So, thematically, though, it makes sense because it's an establishing shot. Mm-hmm. It's one of the most iconic buildings in the continental United States. People say, yep, that's Independence Hall. We're in Philadelphia. Even audiences that don't know better will likely be able to recognize that is where this is. So, tell us a little bit about where the First Continental Congress actually met.
Wasn't it in Carpenter's Hall?
It was.
Yes. Which was not, correct me if I'm wrong because it's been a minute, but it doesn't have the prestige that Independence Hall has, or the amenities that Independence Hall has. Not really the place that comes to mind when you think of declaring independence from the premier world power at the time.
Yeah, it takes place in Carpenter's Hall, which is a trade union building, the Carpenters Company. And it's a very small building.
Yes.
First time I visited it, I was like, wow, this is it? It's like a single room on the first floor. It's like the size of 2 of my living rooms that we're sitting in. But the reason why they had it there is because, they're kind of undermining the king's authority, and maybe it's not a great idea to have that meeting in the Pennsylvania State House, which is the symbol of his authority. And so it's only a few hundred yards away from Independence Hall, and a lot of visitors overlook it when they go to visit the national park there. But it's definitely worth checking out. It's not owned by the Park Service, but it's within the National Park District. So it's definitely a space worth visiting if you're checking out Independence Hall.
And what an interesting symbol that the first meeting takes place in a trade guild rather than in a hall of government. That's a lot of the kind of mythology that surrounds independence, is that these were a bunch of people who were like everyday people who were banding together, which I would argue that point. But it is an interesting moment where they are using this hall that is meant for people who work with their hands for a living.
And they're also businessmen, and money is very much on their minds at this stage of the game.
And as far as this series goes, I am sure that they didn't want to pay to build two different sets. We're back to the iconography of the child throwing things at British soldiers, which is kind of a hearkening back to what happens in the last episode with the Boston Massacre.
Mm-hmm. And so this is supposed to be their homestead in Braintree, and a lot of people went to the actual site today expecting to see this. It's a little bit more built up and modernized around it. This was actually filmed in Virginia. Mm-hmm. Pretty much all of it was filmed in the vicinity of Richmond and Williamsburg. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a single shot of it was actually made in Massachusetts.
No, it was all filmed down there.
Yeah, which I read was a point of frustration for Massachusetts homeboy Matt Damon, who was like, this is about John Adams. Like, come on, Massachusetts. Like, we want this to be filmed in our state, our Commonwealth, excuse me.
Yes.
And so, an interesting story here about where should this be filmed.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Virginia had the aesthetic
Yes.
that the filmmakers were looking for. And of course, they probably saved tens of millions of dollars by filming in a place like Colonial Williamsburg.
Yes. Well, and Virginia does a pretty sweet deal for filmmakers. They do some great tax breaks and tax credits. So it's a lot, Virginia stands in for a lot of different places. I went to see the reenactment of the Battle of Lexington and Concord when I was probably, 10 or 11. It was our Patriots Day weekend trip. And we got to the bridge and we were waiting and the British never showed up. And at the time I was like, what's going on? But now I can kind of see, like, this film can portray something emotionally that you can't always get in a reenactment. So in reality, I think this is a depiction of not just the glory of what happened, which is what you hear about often when you hear about the shot heard round the world, but the real pain and suffering that follows is very hard to portray in real life when you're on a battlefield pretending to shoot one another.
Gage sent a regiment to seize our powder and arms at Concord. Hundreds of our militia turned out. The British got nothing.
So another point of clarity here is the fact that John Adams did not ride into the midst of the battle or its immediate aftermath. He rode to some of the battle sites of Lexington and Concord, I believe April 22nd, 1775, a few days after the smoke had cleared. So this is another example of the film forwarding his narrative, and rather than him reading about it or someone explaining it to him, places him in the midst of it. And it's very compelling, though, because you see all these shrouded individuals and bloodied figures roaming about. So it works.
Oh, that white work kerchief, though, is just everything.
Well, there can be no mistaking Britain's intentions now.
Sometimes Paul Giamatti's greatest moments of acting in this series are these little moments of subtlety. The part where he's leaning up against the wagon trying to hold back his tears, I think it's just like really good acting. A lot of actors would have overdone a scene like that, but he just has such gravitas in his portrayal here. It's the little moments like that I think are really compelling.
Country boys with no experience of professional soldiering, with their faces shining like the sun through a church window.
I think this series does a really good job of making it all human. We talked a little bit about that in the last episode, talking about the reality of the Boston Massacre. But in this moment, I think when you look back in the history books, you say, this is the moment where everybody came together and was excited to move forward on this cause. We're finally fighting. But in reality, people died. And the families that were directly affected were probably not happy about the fact that this was a uniting cause or a uniting moment.
Not had them forced upon them.
I do not have time to cuddle like a young girl courting a beau, Abigail.
I'm not a fan of her jumps that she's wearing over her gown. I know there are extant examples of that garment, but I just don't love it.
Resolving nothing. To subject myself to that yet again, I cannot.
To make reference to another celebrated film of the American Revolution, my favorite song in the movie 1776 is Mama Look Sharp, and it's one of the more serious songs in the movie. And it's about this courier who's a poor Massachusetts farmer, and in the context of the Vietnam War, when that musical was done, it's about wealthy people sending young farm boys to die on their behalf. And so it kind of goes to some of your points, about motivations for fighting Wow, versus like who's actually fighting the war. So interesting things to think about through a historical lens.
Have you stolen these gentlemen from Massachusetts? There they are, all the way from Boston.
Of course, Franklin needs an entrance. It's such a Franklin entrance, too.
Although I don't believe he was carried in on a litter to Independence Hall till the Constitutional Convention a dozen or so years later. He was still a little bit more nimble on his feet at this point, but it makes for quite the entrance, as you suggest.
I beseech you.
Entreat. You left out entreat.
I entreat you to remember that we remain the king's subject.
So one thing that strikes me here is that you're only seeing the delegates, and in reality, there's a lot of people surrounding them. There's probably a lot of black men or boys who are in this situation, listening to what's going on, and they're quite literally there to empty chamber pots or, you know, conduct the business that is needed to be conducted. Most of these people, John Adams aside, traveled to this convention with enslaved people. So what it must have been like to hear this debate and stand there not having the legal voice of your own to point out the hypocrisy.
And to add insult to injury, they're omitted from the cinematic depiction of all this, which...
it becomes a very white room.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society.
I think that's a fair point, that the English Constitution, which wasn't a written document, but it was an amalgamation of all these precedents that had been set, gave more rights to the English people than many other European countries. So there is this fear of, if we break away from that, are we going to end up in a worse position than we're in right now? You know, you have the right to property, you have the right to a trial, like all of those things that we think of as American rights, we really kind of stole from the British. So there is this fear in this moment. Of course, those rights only apply if you are a white member of society, again, but...
It's worth mentioning on top of that, too, that Americans actively desired to be British.
Yes.
You know, this wasn't a long-standing schism, and King George II and King George III's faces were on every sort of bit of kitchen memorabilia and decorative art and household furnishings imaginable. People expressed their loyalty to the monarchy because that was the source of income, and there's prestige that went along with that. And so I think that's something really important to remember.
Yeah, it was a very symbiotic relationship. The colonies existed as a market for many of those British consumable goods, and in return got to sell the things that were goods and cash crops from here. And so it existed very well until it didn't.
But your Quaker sensibilities do us a gross disservice. It is one thing to turn the other cheek, but to lie down on the ground.
I do think they do a good job of representing different cultures of different colonies, and we, I think, sometimes cast this wide brush of people came to America because religious freedom or to, you know, to have their own property. But each colony was settled by a different group of people that had a different goal. So yes, the idea of a group of Quakers settling in Pennsylvania is going to be very different than a group of people in Virginia where they want to harvest tobacco and make that money. It's completely different societies. Trying to make everybody agree with one another is difficult.
We will exhaust all peaceful approaches, Mr. Adams, and we will do it with or without the approbation of you and your Boston insurrectionists.
I think the representation of Dickinson in this series, at least in the context of Pennsylvania history, shows the complexity of political thought in this Commonwealth at this given time. Because on one hand, you have people like Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Rush, who is also depicted here in the series, who are increasingly ardent patriots. And then you have Dickinson, who is a Quaker and thereby a pacifist and very hesitant to jump onto the Patriot bandwagon, even though he is sympathetic with many of the Patriot ideals. And Dickinson College here in Pennsylvania is named after him, and it's a major law school here in the state still. And then there is the Penn family as the third equivalent, the descendants of William Penn, who don't want to cut themselves from the purse strings of the crown because they realize if Pennsylvania separates itself and joins off in this venture, that they lose their power and their money as a result. And so those are the three categories that at least Pennsylvanians find themselves in. I think the film does a pretty good job of showing these different segments of society.
You seem a little
Distracted, Mr. Adams.
I love that they do show a moment where they're having these conversations in a tavern, because so often the big conversations that happen in the big buildings, the Independence Halls, the Capitol buildings, are only happening there because they've already happened behind closed doors in a private room or a public room at a tavern. So much politicking has already happened by the time you step into that room that you probably already know how everybody's going to vote and what everybody's opinions are.
Their vote went against me as well.
Virginia must be one, Mr. Adams. Their wealth, prestige, their size. No other colony carries that much weight.
Franklin's talking about Virginia and how Adams needs to get Virginia's vote. In fact, Peyton Randolph was the president of the First Continental Congress, and he was, they were calling him at that point the father of the country. And he was a little bit more moderate, and so it's interesting to think about. He dies in 1775 in Philadelphia. It's interesting to think about what would have happened, how things might have been different if his voice had remained a part of this conversation.
What's up to myself, Colonel Washington.
Colonel Washington.
I have seen so few people tailor 18th century generals' clothes in the right way, and it drives me nuts. It's the breeches that get you every time. They're just never tailored enough.
Speaking of appearances, too, here in regard to General Washington, he's too old.
Yes.
Because you have to keep in mind that he's essentially in his mid-40s at this point, and instead we get the guy who's on the $1 bill. Now, in here too, much like the establishing shot of showing Independence Hall, it's to trigger immediate recognition on the part of audience members. But he had kind of a darker salt and pepper reddish hair, at this time here. He still had some youth and vigor to him. I mean, for God's sake, he was only a few years older than I was, here at this time. And Thomas Jefferson was a year younger than me. It makes me feel really inadequate in this regard. But in any case, Washington, he did come in his military uniform to the convention, but it was I believe his old Virginia militia uniform, which was red and blue, not like the Continental uniform like we see here. And so David Morse does a fantastic job as Washington. I think it's one of the best cinematic portrayals of Washington. But in these early episodes with him, his appearance is off.
I will tell you this. If I hear guns going off outside in the middle of the night, I am not putting stays on to go out and check. I'm going out in a wrapping gown, and that's as much as we're...
We saw flames above the harbor.
Gage's ships laid into us with cannon fire. He sent the butchers through the smoke up Bunker Hill.
There's a few really good things in this scene. There's also a few ahistorical things that we see in the scene. This is all prefaced by the British Navy's bombardment of the Boston area as the prologue to the Battle of Breed's Hill. Why these Patriot forces would be marching past their home in Braintree, I don't know why. And he also refers to it as Bunker Hill. I don't think they would have referred to it as Bunker Hill at that given time, unless the confusion had already set in. Probably would have referred to it at Breed's Hill. And they drove them back on several occasions, but the British eventually did
Take
persevere. You don't get a sense that it's a very weird sort of conversation that's happening out here between Mrs. Adams and the soldier.
While we await answer, we must avoid any escalation of the hostilities between us.
In contrast to 1776, Mr. Dickinson has a far more sympathetic portrayal in this one. He's very antagonistic and mean-spirited in 1776. This one, we get a better understanding of his thinking, why he's saying what he does, what motivates him to say these things. And I think it creates some really good complexity for the audience's consideration. I think these scenes, for as condensed and perhaps simplified to an extent that they are, it gets the big picture across.
Yes. Yes, it's really easy to say that, you know, it was a just act to declare independence, that everybody agreed with it, but that is so far from reality. The watered down version is that there's always, there's a few groups of people here. There are people who were for the Declaration and for independence. There are people who are anti, who really felt like the British government was the best protection. And then there's the third group of people who either aren't recognized as part of society or just have to work, and it doesn't matter who's in charge. You just got to get that work done.
And I propose, as Commander-in-Chief, our most honorable and esteemed delegate, the good gentleman from Virginia, Colonel George Washington.
Adams's nomination of Washington, I think, is very symbolic of his political genius. Even though he was often well known for burning his bridges, he also had the capacity to build them as well. And certainly his selection as Washington here is a good indicator of that. The thing to remember, though, is that Washington showed up to this gig in uniform for a reason. Mm-hmm. He was essentially advertising himself as, hey guys, I'm available. I'm willing to do this thing if you want me to. Look at me in my nice big uniform, tallest guy in the room. So, you know, I think that too, perhaps he wasn't as taken aback or surprised as he is in the film here. And so he was vying for it. And perhaps he made a slight gesture to Adams indicating as much.
What is that but an army of occupation? And the Congress goes on its knees to the king.
She needs some better wool.
It helps that it's not real snow.
It's true.
They aren't really in Massachusetts. So it guards you very well against artificial snow.
Man, my favorite piece of clothing was my good wool cloak. It was thick enough that I've used it as a blanket multiple occasions. A good cloak will get you many, many places.
This war touches people that your Congress treats with the same contempt King George reserves for the people of Boston.
In my mind here, Abigail really gets to the heart of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
And earlier you were speaking about, you know, women were thinking of these things and aware of these things and so on and so forth. Perhaps you can speak to that a little bit further here.
Yes, there are examples as early as the Stamp Act of women banding together and saying, we have a political voice too. We have the duty to step out from behind, you know, our femme couvert, our women covered status, and you know that might mean that your husband is your legal voice, but that doesn't mean he has to be your political voice. That you can be involved in this too. In fact, during the war, there is a pamphlet written and published called "Sentiments of an American Woman," that basically says it is your job to raise patriots. You've got to raise them, and you've got to be willing to send them off to war, just like the women of antiquity. So there's this really real Republican womanhood idea that begins to be developed fairly early. Now, women have always had a political voice. If you're speaking within what people deem to be your sphere, then it's fine for you to have that political voice. But if not, you might end up in a courthouse or something like that. There's a great book called Brabbling Women that is about that very subject.
And there's a lot of scholarship on what a what you mentioned evolves into Republican motherhood.
Yes.
That it's the responsibility of women to raise good citizens and
Yes.
enlightened individuals. And so there's a connective tissue here in that regard. Great point.
And the Congress will find whatever you require, sir.
Nothing has yet come from all their promises.
It is true that Washington writes repeatedly throughout the war that he doesn't have what he needs and that he's being asked to do everything with nothing. I know he writes Governor Henry, Patrick Henry, when he's the governor of Virginia, saying, you need to get Virginia in particular to send me more supplies. And Henry keeps writing back and saying, I'm asking, I'm trying. But at some point you can't eat trying, you know.
First, let's free Boston. The rest will follow.
If I recall correctly, these Cambridge scenes were likewise filmed at Colonial Williamsburg. Can you tell us anything about the historical building that we see here in the background behind the camp?
That is the public hospital. It is reconstructed, so
Okay.
but it was the first building that was built, I believe, in North America to house people that are considered non-compos mentis or mentally unfit, unable to take care of themselves. There are some really sobering statistics about what those people were given, where they were kept. It wasn't a kind place to be sent. Not to go on about Patrick Henry, but his first wife was suffering from a mental illness. I can't tell you for sure what it was. Some people have speculated it was postpartum depression. But he took a look at the public hospital and refused to have her there. He decided to provide for her at home instead.
How we will manage.
So I do think it's interesting. This show does show a lot of everyday things that a lot of shows don't, and one of them is cleaning. Looks like she's using a pumice stone or something of that nature. Another method is to use sand. So you use damp sand and scrub with damp sand, and then once the sand is dried a little bit, you can sweep it up. But all of that should go with the grain of the wood.
Yeah. Well, she's frustrated. She's taking it out.
She's
on
taking
the
it out
floor,
on that
so
knot.
I don't blame her. But it's a good point to raise, because even though they don't know about germs, they have some notion of cleanliness, and we get a sense of that in this scene. She's pouring some sort of liquid or alcohol or disinfectant or something on the floor to go along with the bar that she's scraping on the floorboards.
There's a great servants directory book that you can find a reproduction copy of that gives you all these wonderful cleaning methods that tell you some medicine as well.
For those who persist in their treason, the punishment shall be death by hanging.
So what we're seeing here is the king's rejection of what was called the Olive Branch Petition. And some people question the sincerity of the Olive Branch Petition, because it was just a few days prior that the Second Continental Congress had authorized the invasion of Canada. They wanted control of it. Not necessarily a good way to convey peaceful tidings by launching an invasion of a nearby territory. But in any case, the rejection of this was considered the final straw by many. It was ratified almost exactly a year prior to the Declaration of Independence, July 5th, 1775. And so it's a very dramatic year between these two Julys that sets the two societies on a collision course. The molding of lead into musket balls, is this a typical activity that you would have trusted kids with?
I would not trust a small child with that activity. And in fact, there's something to be said about things being cheaper to buy pre-manufactured. And, maybe at some point somebody gets to that point where they need to do that. But I don't think we're at that point yet. And even if we were, I wouldn't have a 8-year-old, 9-year-old child.
It's a fair point. It's a fair point for sure. But all that said, lead was in an immensely short supply here in the American colonies. and it prompted rather unsuccessful attempts here in our area of central Pennsylvania at places like Fort Roberdeau, which became known as the lead mine fort.
Yes.
But even in places where you could extract lead out of the ground and try to melt it down and turn it into bullets, these sorts of outposts were so far removed from any other points of Anglo civilization that it was almost not worth the effort in the long run. And so it speaks to the logistical difficulty of supplying an army.
What are you doing?
British guns captured at Fort Ticonderoga. General Washington may have some use for them.
So he's talking about the American victory at Fort Ticonderoga. I don't think logistically it makes sense for them to walk past the Adamses' house with captured cannon. That's going pretty far out of your way, tugging these giant, massive artillery pieces. I think we could agree that probably didn't happen that way.
Indeed. Some more theatrical liberties taken here to involve the family in the broader saga of the American Revolution. But the real story behind the moving of about 60 artillery pieces from Fort Ticonderoga, Henry Knox, the general who we see here in the film, former bookseller, later to become the first Secretary of War under George Washington. They started this endeavor in December of 1775, and they didn't get the guns to Dorchester Heights here until March of 1776. And so it was this 3-month-long trek, like he said, across the Berkshires. They had to haul the guns across the frozen Hudson at 4 different locations, and they were using oxen up and down the hills, the valleys, and across these frozen rivers and lakes. It was a hell of a journey, but it was ultimately the deciding factor that prompted the British, when they looked up at Dorchester Heights and had kind of an oh crap moment that we can't face off with that. They couldn't elevate their guns high enough to shoot back even if they wanted to. And so that's what prompts the British capitulation of Boston, which as we see here in these scenes, further invigorates our esteemed colleagues here at Independence Hall.
Resolved that these united colonies are, and of a right ought to be, free and independent states.
The one delegate who raises up the paper saying that we should be free and independent states, that is Richard Henry Lee. And that is of the very acclaimed and achieved family of the Lees of Virginia. And of course, he is an ancestor of Robert E. Lee, of later fame here too. And so a very politically connected institution of a family.
I believe that he was supposed to be a tax collector at one point for the stamp tax and got himself in a little bit of hot water, but I'd have to fact check that. But that he at the very beginning was not as pro-revolution as he is by the end.
Only the voice of the people can proclaim independence.
No! The people wait for us to lead the way.
I show some scenes of this series in my Pennsylvania history class. I think all in all, it's a good encapsulation of the sorts of conversations that are happening. And it's not just these stuffy figures in powdered wigs. There's life and breath and dynamics to their conversations. And these scenes where they're yelling at each other, I particularly enjoy because it kind of takes them down off their pedestals a little bit and shows them as these very angry and uncertain human beings that they were. And you would think that, 19 and 20-somethings who are in my class, if something isn't blowing up, it wouldn't hold their attention for very long. But they find these scenes really riveting. And it really helps them visualize the time period more than anything else. And so as you can all very well guess, I'm not one who hesitates in using film excerpts in the classroom.
Notion that Parliament has. When Demosthenes...
I love when he takes his wig off. It's just too hot anymore.
This, too, is something that demythologizes them a little bit, because it's almost impossible to envision some of these people without their powdered wigs or their curled up hair. And so, yeah, the moment of frustration here, it's palpable.
I have a colleague who portrays George Wythe, and that's one of his favorite tools to do is he'll take his wig off when he's talking to somebody and say, "Can I speak to you man to man?" And it's just perfect because it really tears down that wall.
I really like that.
The thought of what awaits us in New York robs me of my sleep.
Good little material culture detail was George Washington's headquarters flag. People may have been wondering what was that blue banner with the white stars on it. And that was George Washington's headquarters flag. So wherever you saw that flag, George Washington was not far away.
Is it? I believe it is in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. They have.
I'm not sure.
They have I know they have the reproduction of his tent, but I think that they have a repro of his flag as well, and then they may actually have an original flag. I think it's the only one that survives.
His original tent is at the Museum of the American Revolution.
Yeah, they have both.
Your advice is greatly valued by Mr. Adams. The more quickly he receives it, the more quickly we may all be beneficiaries of your counsel.
I could definitely see Abigail as being one who would have the guts to call out George Washington on slavery to his face. What do you think?
Oh, I think that she, at least in her written word, she's not afraid to say what's on her mind. I want to believe that in public as well. Of course, you're going to do that in a way that is polite and is not going to completely ruin your family's career, but I think that she may have. And he had some complicated feelings on the thoughts of slavery, but everybody did. And if you still own enslaved people, then questioning it doesn't make it good enough.
And it's around the same time that he's having a really interesting written correspondence with Phyllis Wheatley.
Yes.
As well. African-American woman who is enslaved and is one of the first great poets of United States history. And so complicated indeed.
Yes. We had an interesting conversation, some of my colleagues and I. There's that one very famous engraving of Phyllis Wheatley where she's presented with a cap and with a breast knot, a bow, and the question is, did she dress herself this way, or did her marketers dress her this way, or did her mistress dress her this way?
Should you not write this thing yourself?
Oh, no. I do not have time.
These questions and conversations about Adams trying to delegate some of his duties and getting Jefferson to write the Declaration and him mentioning that he serves on 24 different committees. There's a single line from some of Adams's correspondence that I always say to my students, and that line which he wrote to Abigail was, "We know not what to do first."
Yes.
Because it's a very difficult proposition trying to create a country from scratch and all of the institutional infrastructure that is required to support an endeavor like this. And so these guys were completely overwhelmed, even busybodies like John Adams.
Yes. A lot of the local municipalities are just crossing out the part of like their legal procedures that say God save the king and continuing to use the same documents, the same services in church. You're just going to keep going as far as you can with what you've got.
I am aware of the risks.
Some cases have even resulted in death.
An interesting discussion on smallpox inoculation. There's great fears of smallpox in communities right now. In fact, in Yorktown, Virginia, there was supposed to be a quarantine facility that was set up, but the city was so afraid of the quarantine facility that they didn't want it there. So basically, that doesn't help you with an epidemic to avoid it if you're kicking people out of the quarantine facility.
It's been very interesting, especially in more recent times with the COVID-19 pandemic, to go back and read some of the thoughts of the founding fathers on inoculation, the equivalent of vaccination today. And most of them were pretty adamant, at least the well-known ones depicted here. Benjamin Franklin, the Adamses, George Washington, Jefferson, they were all big proponents of inoculation. Jefferson had all of his family, all of his children inoculated. George Washington made inoculations mandatory while his army was encamped at Valley Forge because it was this mundane biological stuff that was going to kill off his army if he didn't intervene in some way. And so they were really clear on the matter. And a lot of them considered themselves men of science, Jefferson and Franklin especially. So it's little wonder that they took that perspective.
Yes. And there's fear, too, from the communities when the army rolls into town. One of the first rumors you see in almost every newspaper account is they're bringing smallpox. So it's an army fear, but it's also a community fear as well.
If the trade is outlawed but ownership is not, then those unfortunate Negroes still in servitude will become a more lucrative commodity.
That also brings us back to Ben Franklin, who himself was a slave owner, but later gravitates toward abolitionism. Later in his life, helps establish an abolitionist society in Philadelphia. One of the lines that he says here, though, in the film that I think is really interesting, that he mentions that if the importation of enslaved people is cut, then those who remain here are going to be a more lucrative commodity as a result. And as we look at later measures taken by the founders, this is exactly what happens when the importation of slaves. The door closes in 1808, about 20 years after the Constitution. And so here, once again, there's some historical foreshadowing. Things that Franklin himself won't see, but his character, at least in this regard, correctly predicts what's on the horizon. And Jefferson is the perfect enigma when it comes to notions of freedom and slavery. And of course, he fathers multiple children with one of his slaves as well. But there's a line of his that's very pertinent to this conversation, that it's the perfect representation of how so many slave owners felt. And he said that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't want to be holding on to it, but at the same time you don't dare let go of it. And in so many ways, slavery was kind of like a drug. I mean, a lot of them knew that it was bad for the country, yet they couldn't detach themselves economically or emotionally from what they considered to be its benefits.
Yes. However, there are people who do. Robert Carter was a very prominent person in Virginia. He had a lot of property, and a lot of that property consisted of enslaved people. He experienced a religious conversion. He became a Baptist, and he set himself on a route to emancipate those enslaved people. So there are examples of people who decided to take action, but this is not one of them.
These truths are self-evident, are they not?
Perhaps.
It's scenes like this in Kirk Ellis's script that I just think are so masterfully crafted, because it brings about these hypothetical conversations, some version of which probably happened. And like, how did these iconic phrases of American identity come into being? And I think these are really fantastic depictions of what might have happened and how these conversations played out.
I think it's interesting, too, that Jefferson just said, and every word must be chosen precisely, which means that every word in the Declaration, if you take that view, is chosen precisely, including words like, and this is a slur, so just please don't use it in everyday language, but merciless Indian savages. That is in our Declaration, and it is a racist slur, and it was used as a motivating factor to get people to rally together.
A marvelous invention, Mr. Jefferson.
Yes, I went through a number of variations. This is by far the most successful.
I love that at the end of the day, though, like, they do get the Jefferson is a nerd factor in there, because he was a huge nerd.
One more time, lad.
So this is depicting the process of inoculation, which, unlike vaccination today, what you're doing with inoculation is you're taking pus from somebody who has the sickness and basically giving a very, very small amount under your skin.
The cringe factor on this scene always ranks high for my students when they see it. And it by and large shows the procedure as how it was done, although for the Adamses themselves, it didn't quite happen under these circumstances. Abigail actually took her family into Boston where the doctor was performing these procedures. And I believe she took 12 or 14 people into the city to likewise get inoculated. And so it wasn't a matter of the doctor coming to them. She had to kind of take her family into the snake pit, so to speak. You know, that there's a cauldron of potentially sick people. And so there was an even greater risk involved than what the film suggests.
I want Papa. Papa's not here. We must depend upon ourselves.
I love that they're showing the material culture of the young lady wearing stays, finally, and a proper shift. Of course, Abigail Adams is wearing a short sleeve shift, which is a 19th century thing, but I will forgive that for the purpose of the scene being to cut her arm open.
This day, I expect, will give the finishing blow to my once great and now much diminished popularity.
It's interesting when he talks about the consequences of this day. The people in this room would be well aware of what it means to fight and lose against the British power, because they would have within their lifetimes probably known somebody who had some connection to the Scottish uprising in the middle of the 18th century. And the price of the Scottish uprising was not simply people being hanged as traitors or drawn and quartered as traitors, but also the loss of culture, the loss of the ability to speak their language, to sing their songs, to wear their national dress. So that's what you're risking. You're not just risking your life, you're risking everything.
The full fury of British wrath will be unleashed. Indians will be loosed on the frontier. Negroes will rise up.
There's the reference to the fear of the American Indian or Native American nations, who they're going to align with, and what that means for people living out further to the west, which is especially in Pennsylvania a constant fear.
Some have argued that America will become one great commonwealth. But what is to keep 13 unwieldy colonies from splitting asunder?
What do you think of that foreshadowing?
Well, the founders were under little illusion that these problems were someday going to erupt in some sort of factional divide, the form of civil war. A few years before he passes away, Jefferson predicts this as the potential death knell of the Union, a fire bell in the night, he says of this warning. And so whether it be in the 1770s or the 1820s, these guys, they're playing a lethal game of kick the can.
Yeah.
They're letting a future generation worry about it. They have their own problems. They're pretty much of the mind, hey, slavery, a lot of those issues, someone else is just going to have to take care of them, because we can only handle so much at any one given time. But it leads to other interesting questions about how ultimately both sides during the Civil War look up to these guys as heroes, nonetheless,
Yes.
because both sides see a little bit of themselves in these guys, whether they're from the North or the South. And so then, as well as now, there are history wars and arguments over historical memory and who represents what. So that's nothing new.
We are in the very midst of revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world.
I do rather wish that some of these were recorded. So many arguments have been lost to time that we just don't know what was said to make that to convince people.
It's great speculation, though, on the part of Kirk Ellis, and I really have to give hats off to him because he took on this mammoth task of taking this several hundred-page book and making it into something digestible. But he so effectively uses the language and the rhetoric of the time, even if it is amalgamated in some form. It's just really eloquently written, and it's an Emmy Award well earned.
Yes.
In my mind.
Yeah, and it follows their each character's personal writing style really truthfully and faithfully.
My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it.
My filmmaker brother really enjoys these scenes with the lightning because it's one of the few movies that actually shows the delay, because most movies show lightning and thunder happening at the same time, and there's actually the proper scientific separation here. It has nothing to do with history, but it's just a worthy production note.
Idle misspent of time. Wasted breath.
In my almost decade of working in a 18th century town, it was those everyday moments that I really like, when everybody would come in off the street and hang up a cloak and a hat without thinking about it and walk away. These magic moments of just humanity.
Admiral Howe has anchored 150 ships in view of Manhattan Island, and you ask me to consent to our own destruction.
Another great bar scene.
I thank you for that, Mr. Adams.
He's holding a card deck that has the stamp on it still.
Good attention to detail. Question is, would a Quaker have a deck of cards in his house?
This is a very good question. And would those cards still have a stamp from the Stamp Act? Maybe in a Quaker house where they've never been opened.
Cool.
There are some accounts that say that Charles was one of the kids who was really sick. He was essentially unconscious for the better part of 2 days and delirious with fever. And so you can, kind of be nitpicky about, which children were affected most and how. But suffice it to say, it really delivered a punch to the Adams household after their inoculation. But it very well probably saved their lives in the long run, too.
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania votes yes.
Delaware.
I think in a lot of theatrical presentations, the moment that is dramatized with high drama, it's the reading versus the actual vote. So I like the choice to make the role of the delegates the dramatic moment here.
And this moment is actually July 2nd.
Yes.
And not July 4th.
Yes. This is a soapbox that I will stand on and scream for the rest of my days.
So explain to folks the root of confusion here, July 2nd versus July 4th.
So July 2nd was the day that they voted for independence. July 4th was the day that it was publicly proclaimed and kind of entered the public consciousness.
And nor was it signed on the 4th of July as well. Delegates were coming and going for weeks on end, and they were signing it through August.
Yes,
1776.
In fact, in George Wyth's case, they left him a space because he was not present, and they wanted to make sure he had a prominent space to sign his name.
Stand up, guys.
What's that word there?
Unalienable.
The copy of the Declaration that the Adams family is reading here is a printed broadside version, the type would have been put up in shop windows and whatnot. But in actuality, Adams sent home one of his handwritten copies. And from that, Abigail surmised that he was the one who actually wrote it. And she was so proud of him. But it was a collective effort, and as I tell students, it required these three really unique individuals, and they represented the brains of the Declaration, which was John Adams, the words of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, and the balance of the Declaration, which is Benjamin Franklin. And without that sort of equilibrium, you don't have the document that it ends up being. And so they're all three of them are equally responsible in my mind. They just carried out their mission in different ways.
God save our American states!
God save our American states!
America.
I love that in the shot you can see the Grand Union flag, which has the Great Union flag, which we today call the Union Jack because it's become known as that. But it still has it in the corner. But then you get the 13 stripes. So it's still paying heed to where we've come from and then where we want to go.
Now our work begins. You will think me transported with enthusiasm, but I am not.
It's a great ending to the episode. There's gloomy optimism is the best way that I can describe it. And I think it's the perfect characterization of the moment. All right, so Emily, here we are at the end of episode 2. What are your thoughts on this episode? Where does it excel?
I think it does a very good job of showing the dichotomy of excitement and fear that's happening in these moments, and showing those last little branches that have to break that put us on the path to declaring independence. I really liked the fact that we're hearing a little bit about the domestic side of life in this moment in time, and that it's not just focusing on any of the big declarations or conversations that are happening. I do, again, I understand that they compressed a lot, but like that would be the one thing. If we could get, a ongoing series on just this subject, it could last for a year, but I would watch it.
Yeah. What do you think is the great movie of the American Revolution that's never been made?
Oh boy. I think that I would like to see a movie about the American Revolution in which the American side of the story is not the main voice. And I know that we've had some kind of some movies that play with the idea of loyalism or the idea of British occupation, but I feel like at the end of the day, like I would like to see a really strong movie made as well as this miniseries that puts a different voice in the center.
It's a good idea.
We'll see.
So, as always, a little bit of recommended reading before we depart. And first up, a very concise history, The American Revolution by Gordon Wood. And Gordon Wood is often considered one of the top scholars of the American Revolution. And why this one is helpful, I think it's a good sort of ideological biography of the conflict. He's able to express these really complex thoughts in really concise terms. And so if you want to get a sense of the idea of the American Revolution, you can't go wrong with this very short history of the conflict. And then what is often considered the quintessential book on the making of the Declaration of Independence is called American Scripture by Pauline Maier. And this is a slightly more in-depth look, but really helpful to the understandings and once again just the complexities and all the complicated characters who were involved in the making of this profound document. And so check those out, be informed, and with that we look forward to having you on our next episode as we continue to take a look at HBO's John Adams. So Emily, thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll see you next time.